every single year in the last week of August. The families in my hometown pray that there's no rhododendron blossom on their doorstep. My town was otherwise completely normal. It was a small community, one where everybody knew each other and their grandma. There were a lot of woods and plain fields, and the houses had beautiful gardens. A perfect place to live, one could say. Growing up here had been as amazing as a childhood could be. Everyone around here had kids, so I had plenty of people to play with. We had stayed outside until dawn, explored the nearby woods, rode on our bikes all around town, played hide and seek in the cornfields. As we grew older, we spent our time by the river. My group of friends had become smaller over the years, but that wasn't uncommon. Anyways, my childhood had been great. And yet, every year we feared to find a rhododendron on our doorstep. Harvest Week wasn't something the adults would tell a kid about. But kids are perceptive, way more than most adults give them credit for. They listen, they think, they make connections. And most importantly, they talk to each other. That's how I heard about Harvest Week when I was 14 years old. Early in the morning, before class started, we all sat in our classroom, and a kid named Tommy stood in front of the blackboard, talking about what he had overheard the day before. They said a monster will come and take all the kids away in summer, he explained, frantically waving his hands around. It will mark the doors of the families with children, and then comes back to collect them 5 days later. And the parents have no idea how to stop it. You're full of shit, someone from the back row shouted. I swear, guys, that's what they said. Tommy looked actually desperate. We're doomed. Okay. Doomed. In that moment, our teacher entered the room. An elderly woman, rather small, and with curly gray hair. What is going on here? She asked, looking at the scared boy who stood in front of her class. Tommy says, a monster will take all of us away in summer. His parents said that. One of the girls supplied. The teacher paled a little, stayed quiet for a moment, and shook her head. No one is going to take all of you, she said. Now, please sit down. The wording struck me as strange, but I didn't think too much about it. At that time, I simply thought Tommy had made this story up to get attention. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, especially not something outlandish as this one. A few weeks later, right before summer vacation, the story came up again. Not by Tommy this time, but another girl from my class. Scared of the things Tommy had talked about, she had asked her older brother about it. He had told her about his childhood best friend, who had vanished without a trace. Overnight, the boy had disappeared, had left not a single clue, and was never found. That was when I got scared too. One person making something up was not unusual, but I vaguely remembered the disappearance of the little boy, although I had been very young back then. But it had happened in summer, that much I knew. I went home to my parents and told them about what I had heard, but they were quick to reassure me nothing about it was true. They told me there was not such thing as monsters. My classmates had just made up a spooky story to scare us, and I shouldn't worry about it. Of course, I believed them. On the first day of the last week of August that year, I was out late with the neighbor kid. He was 2 years younger than me, but we got along really well, and he lived just across the road, so we hung out a lot. The sun was just setting, the street lamps turned on the exact moment we reached his doorstep. A rhododendron blossom lay there. The family did not own a rhododendron. My friend picked it up, and rang the doorbell. His mother opened and stared wide-eyed at the flower her son held in his hands. "Where did you get that?" she asked, pale as a ghost. He pointed at the floor. She ushered him and through the door, shut without a goodbye, eyes sparkling with tears. I returned home, of course, and from that day on, I watched the house across the road every night. Asking my parents would have no use, so I simply stayed awake and watched, waiting for something to happen. I saw my friend during the day, but as I asked him, he didn't say anything. Only that his mother had been worried because we had come home a few minutes later than usual. I knew something was wrong, although I couldn't name it at that point. There was no school anyways, so I stayed awake during the night and slept during the day. Nothing happened for 4 nights. My friend behaved as always, and yet I couldn't shake the sense of dread the rhododendron and his mother's reaction had left in me. In night 5, it finally happened. The first sign of its presence was an icy wind blowing through the street. Way too cold for midsummer. A breeze blew through my open window and raised goosebumps all over my body. Next, the lights began to flicker. Every single street light went on and off in absolute unison. The rhythm was slow at first, but quickly grew faster and faster until it made me almost dizzy. The wind was stronger now and cold as winter snow. I leaned forward and gripped the window frame. A figure, cloaked in shadows, walked down the road. They were tall and lanky. That was all I could gather through the flickering light. I was frozen in place as the figure approached my friend's house and stretched their long arms out. The lights went out. All the lights. I was surrounded by absolute darkness. The wind was howling. There was a storm going on outside. I wrapped my arms around my body to protect myself from the piercing cold. For several seconds, maybe even minutes, there was nothing but darkness and the screaming storm. And then, without a warning, there was a flash of lightning. No rain, no thunder, just a bright white flash, and the lights came back again. The shadow figure was gone. I exhaled before I even realized I had held my breath and collapsed onto my bed. The next day, the garden across the road was overgrown with plumeria. The husband, who was a soldier, returned from whatever Middle Eastern country he had been stationed in, entirely unscathed. I never saw my friend again. Nobody ever searched for him. It took me almost a week to gather the courage to go to my parents and confront them with everything I had seen. But when I did, they sat me down at the kitchen table and explained it all. Every year, in the last week of August, a rhododendron blossom is left on the doorstep of a family. 5 nights after that, the thing in the shadows comes and takes the family's child away. The child is never seen again, but the family is granted a wish, and the town thrives for 1 more year. A bargain that can't be refused. But there must be a way to stop this, I pleaded, almost petrified with fear. They then told me about the family, who had tried to defy the thing. A young family had found the rhododendron on their porch, and they did the unspeakable to their infant daughter to save her from the fate that awaited her. 5 days passed without anything happening, until there was another plant on their doorstep. A cypress branch. They died that night, suffocated by cypress that had grown in their lungs. The whole house was still overgrown with said cypress today. Nobody had ever tried to deny the monster its wish ever again. It took me a very long time to get over the disappearance, and almost certainly the subsequent death of my childhood friend. Or maybe I never got over it, not really, but at some point, I stopped crying myself to sleep. His death was never properly acknowledged by the adults, so I took it upon myself to make a little memorial for him. Nothing too special. I tied 2 small planks together, crudely carved his name in with a kitchen knife, and placed it near a pond in the woods, where we had liked to spend our time. And I placed flowers there every single week. The truth my parents had told me terrified me, of course. I appreciated their absolute honesty, but it caused a countless number of sleepless nights. I was afraid something would come for me in the night, take me away to some sort of hell, or just kill me right then and there. Maybe devour me whole without leaving a drop of blood behind. Nothing like that ever happened, of course. The monster never appeared outside of Harvest Week. Now that I knew about Harvest Week, I was painfully aware of the sense of dread that settled all around town at the end of August. How nervous the people got, how on edge everyone was. I wasn't an exception to that anymore. Nightmares about rhododendron and storms and shadows plagued my nights all throughout summer, and I felt actually sick when I returned home on the first day of the last week of August, almost expecting to find a blossom on the porch. I never did, of course. Not for 4 more years. The monster only takes children. I was 18 now, therefore not longer considered a child. My sister, Veronica, was not. She was younger than me, 5 whole years. I will never understand why my parents chose to have another child after such a long time, considering what was going on in our town. They were playing with literal lives here, and it made me sick. I loved my sister. Ronnie was the sweetest girl in the world, and I loved her more than anything. A part of me hated my parents for bringing her into this world, where we had to fear for her life every single year, but I never let her know that. I never told her about Harvest Week. She was a happy child, popular in school, smart, and well-behaved. Her life would be better if she never learned what I had at such a young age. I was an adult now, at least on paper, and I was trying to build a life for myself. My plan, of course, was to leave this town at the first opportunity. I had already talked things through with Henry, my boyfriend of almost 3 years. Leaving my sister, who was 13 years old now, was not an option for me, not with a monster roaming the streets of this town every year. I would take her with me when I left, but for that, I needed money. Henry had a job at the same bank my mother worked at, and it was paid quite well, so that was I start. I was working in the local bakery. It was a simply job with a decent salary. I didn't have a chance to get a better job. My grades had never been great in the first place, and after my friend's death, they dropped even more. After barely managing to graduate high school, I took whatever job I could get. I bought a car a few weeks ago. Nothing special, just a 15-year-old worn-down Honda, but I drove, and it didn't fall apart, and that was all I needed. Henry and I both lived with our parents, and therefore didn't need to pay rent. So we could save almost all of our earnings for our little escape plane. According to our calculations, it would only take us 1 more year until we could get in my car, take Ronnie and away to make a life in a town without monsters. We could leave next summer, before August. Before Harvest Week. The last week of August arrived faster than I had anticipated. But the thought that it was the last Harvest Week I had to survive here was oddly comforting. The familiar dread settled in the summer heat. The entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the monster to pick its next victim. Now I didn't see the rhododendron, but I noticed my parents' strange behavior. It was the 5th harvest week I experienced while being actually aware of what was going on, and I knew by now how they usually behaved during that time. But this year was different. They were more on edge than ever. I heard them arguing faintly in their bedroom, and a few times I saw the tears in their eyes. Dad made Ronnie's favorite food twice this week. They let her eat ice cream for breakfast. She was allowed to stay up way past her bedtime until she fell asleep on the sofa. I realized it after 3 whole days, and I drove to my childhood friend's grave and cried and screamed for a very long time. I came home late at night, Ronnie already fast asleep in her room. Mom and Dad were in the living room, watching television. "When were you going to tell me?" I straight up asked them, voice still trembling. "Honey." Mom stood up and tried to reach out for me. I took a step backwards. "Not at all, right? You would have just waited until she's gone. You wouldn't let me say goodbye to my fucking sister. She doesn't need to know," Dad supplied. "It's easier." "Easier for whom?" I interrupted harshly. "You know what? That's not happening. That thing won't take her. You can't do anything about it." Mom was crying now. "Try me," I hissed and stormed towards my sister's bedroom. I wasn't going to let her be taken away. Not that I wasn't terrified of the thing in the shadows, but if it wanted Ronnie, it had to get past me first. I threw the door open and shook Ronnie awake. She blinked at me, obviously confused. "We have to go, dear," I told her. "Come on, get up." "But it's late." "I'm tired." I know, but this is urgent." "Come on, Ronnie. You can sleep in the car." I held her hand as we climbed through the window to avoid our parents, who would definitely try to stop us. I knew what I was doing was dangerous. I hadn't forgotten the story they had told me 4 years ago. But I wasn't a killer. I wouldn't end a life. I was trying to preserve it. And there were still 2 nights left before the thing would come for my sister. I just knew that if we managed to leave the town, we would be safe. It wouldn't be able to hurt us past the town's borders. I put Ronnie in the car and started to drive. As soon as we had left the town, I would call Henry and tell him to get my things and meet us somewhere. There was no going back now. My sister was asking what was going on, where we were going, why we had to drive away that late, what our parents were going to do, but I didn't answer. I was fully focused on driving through the empty streets. It was past midnight. The town was silent. Ronnie started crying as we left the houses behind us and demanded to know what was going on. "I'll explain it," I reassured her, but my voice was trembling with fear. "I will explain everything when we are in the next town, okay? Just trust me right now." "What about Mom and Dad? Are they coming?" I shook my head. "They won't, sweetie. I'm sorry." "What?" She grabbed my arm. "Are you kidnapping me?" "I'm saving your fucking life, Veronica," I snapped. We had reached the road towards the town's border. A straight street through plain fields only illuminated by a few scattered street lamps. And the lights started to flicker. My heart stopped. "No," I muttered. The end of town was near. We had to make it there. I floored the gas. My old Honda was obviously not made for such high speed anymore and started to rattle, but I didn't slow down. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, it almost hurt, as I tried to outrun the flickering lights. The wind grew stronger. "Slow down," Ronnie screamed. "You're going to crash." I didn't listen. The howling wind threw itself against the car as if it was trying to push us off the road. The flickers grew faster. "It won't get you," I said, more to myself than to my sister. "It won't get you, Ronnie." I turned the air conditioning off, but it still blew icy air into the car, and I noticed frost creeping on the windows. The howling of the wind was almost deafening. I had trouble to keep the car on the road. Ronnie screamed. The lights flickered like a stroboscope. Without warning, the lights went off, and the car came to a sudden halt, as if someone had smashed the brakes. I was thrown against the steering wheel, and then back into my seat in the fracture of a second, completely blinded by the darkness. I reached over and grabbed Ronnie's hand, holding onto her tightly. The air around us was freezing. I heard nothing but the sound of the storm. It was too early, I thought. 2 nights too early. I also thought I was going to die right then and there. With a loud crash, the windows of the car shattered. I screamed as I was showered in tiny shards and tightened my grip around Ronnie's wrist. The following seconds of silence were the longest in my entire life. Suddenly, Ronnie started to scream. She cried in terror as something tried to pull her away, to get her arm from my grip, but I didn't let go. She struggled, she screamed my name, pleaded for me to help her, and for the thing to let her go. The wind blowing through the broken windows was a deafening cacophony. "Let her go." A voice, cold as the storm, whispered in my ear. I didn't. The frost was grasping me. I felt it in my fingertips first, and in my entire hand next, until it was completely numb. Ronnie was still screaming, and maybe I was too. The car was shaking. The strength of the wind left me unable to move. I couldn't feel my hand anymore. I couldn't feel how Ronnie's arm slipped from my grasp. There was an ear-piercing scream, a sudden strike of lightning, and then the lights came back on, and I was alone in the middle of the road. The windows were still broken. My sister was gone. They had to amputate my hand at the hospital. The frostbite was too severe. It was beyond saving as I arrived. Nobody questioned how I got a frostbite in the middle of summer. Nobody questioned where my sister had gone. Yellow poppy bloomed all over my parents' garden. Mom got promoted in her already high-paying job. Dad received a letter that he had inherited a lot of money from a distant relative he hadn't even known about. My boss gave me an unexpected raise. I cried when I received the paycheck. I moved in with Henry almost immediately. Since I earned more money now, we could afford a small apartment together, and I couldn't stand living with my parents anymore. Not after everything that had happened. And I couldn't continue to live in the same house my sister had lived. We still want to leave, but I don't think I still can. If I ever could have anyways. The thing is, after feeling sick for a few weeks now, I just came back from the doctor. Turns out, I'm pregnant. I'm on birth control. Henry and I have always used condoms. I have tried to leave. Exited the doctor's office, got into my car, and started driving. My car broke down in front of the town's border. I tried to go by foot, but no matter how hard I tried, I ended up walking in circles. Every time I ended up in front of the large sign welcoming me to town, the painted bluebells almost mocking me. I gave up eventually. Sometime after sunset, I returned home. There was a tansy lying on my bed. My security guard friend let me into a mall that's been abandoned since the early 2000s. Told him I was looking for haunted places. We go during daylight, about an hour or so before the sun sets, and during the drive my friend gives me a rundown of the place. Says it opened in the 1970s and went through many anchor stores, smaller chain stores, and mom and pops before shuttering indefinitely. The owners of the property haven't demolished it, and in the meantime they send security daily to check. Apparently, it's regularly visited by vandals, or so they say. As for why it was closed, there's of course the pretty standard reasons: crime in the area, competing with smaller shopping centers that sprang up, and competing with online retail. But there may be other reasons. My friend tells me about the stories. He says workers and store owners would sometimes hear odd noises before and after closing time, when there were hardly any people. These included loud scratching noises and beating coming from walls. Pest control was called on too many occasions to count. One store clerk supposedly said he saw something squatting behind clothing racks with something in its hands, though details of what the thing and what it was holding were anybody's guess now. Weird stuff would happen with people's electronics, particularly computers and cell phones. According to my friend, near the end workers would open their stores to find store computers on with documents open and random sequences of letters typed. They'd be random until someone spotted actual English words within the gibberish, as if whoever had typed them had gotten lucky. Cell phones in the early 2000s, also near the end, would get lost and be found later with weird photographs, most of them completely dark. I accuse my friend of pulling my leg, but he isn't finished. He tells me about how before it was an indoor shopping mall, it was an outdoor shopping center. Before that, a park next to a church. And before that, back in the late 1800s, almost at the turn of the century, Native American burial mounds that had been there had been moved to another location. He tells me that, according to legend, those had been warriors that had been buried. They'd been buried there to keep watch against something below. I ask him which tribe, and he says he isn't sure. I tell him he's pulling my leg so much, he might as well pull it completely off. He tells me soberly that he's just relaying information from his fellow security guards. Nobody even goes there at night anymore, and that is a fact. And if I doubt it, I can just ask the others. We drive up to the abandoned shopping mall and get out. Inside, the shopping mall has some natural lighting from the skylights. Things are in such poor condition, though, that it seems to have been shut up well before the early 2000s. My friend says the owners blame vandals who have put holes in the walls and ceiling. The owners gave up trying to patch them. Things get weathered more quickly because of that. Garbage litters the floor. There is no graffiti, but there are smears slathered onto and grooves cut out of walls. Glass has been busted out of railings and storefronts, where there aren't plywood and concrete blocks. Insulation has been torn out of gashes in the wall and strewn all over the place. Mold is everywhere. The escalators wobble when I step on them. There is no power, obviously. We take similar escalators down like rotten rubber stairs to the theater in the basement. My security guard friend has to start using his flashlight, and I'm using my cell phone's flashlight app, so I don't take as many pictures as I'd like. I did take a few pictures of a theater room we went into, a room absent of seats, but I don't think those are as relevant. What seemed most important to my friend was this hole he was telling me about. It was in the sub-basement. So we go down again, stairs this time, into a smaller area with pipes and generators. Beyond that bluish machine and the photograph above, and at the corner of that side of the building, we come upon a 6 feet by 3 feet or so hole in the concrete. The dirt directly beneath is loose. My security guard friend shines his flashlight on it so I can take a picture. My friend tells me they used to dare each other to go into that hole, him and his security guard co-workers that come by here. They even used it to haze a couple of guys. That stopped though when one of their guys disappeared. He came back out of the hole shaken, but wouldn't say what he saw, and disappeared a few days later. He had a wife and a baby on the way too. My friend says he doesn't know how or when that hole got made. At this point, I say how disappointed I am in him for embellishing the lie like that. I get ready to go inside. Isn't that what he's goading me to do? He tries to stop me, but I don't listen. It doesn't appear at first that the hole goes anywhere. I'm not worried, maybe not as worried as I should be, about the loose dirt crushing me. But when I stick my head in, I find that a passage large enough to crawl through goes off to one side. I wriggle in a little, using my cell phone to light the way. The walls are more solid farther in. It's like the hole in the concrete and looser dirt was dug into much older tunnels. It's stagnant and musty down there. I crawl a few minutes and snap a few photographs before I hear something moving in there with me. I want it to be coming from behind and just be my security guard friend on the other side. But a grating, rasping sound is coming from up ahead of me in the tunnel. And there's no denying, it's the sound of something crawling. I cut a picture of it as it turned a corner about a dozen feet in front of me. Its eyes are bright and almost liquid or plasma-like. Its jaw doesn't appear normal either. Don't know if it was a trick of the dark and the technology I used to capture it, and it was only some ordinary animal. But that's the picture my cell phone took. Whatever it is, snakes back a little ways before stopping. It disappears from my view while I'm crawling backwards more quickly than I'd normally crawl forwards. I'm shouting the whole time. I panic more when I feel something grab me from behind and pull. My stomach gets scraped to bleeding from one edge of the concrete part of the hole, but it's my friend that is pulling me out. I show him the pic, and we both run back towards the stairs. Next few days, and I'm posting these pictures and my experience on an image board website. I go to sleep feeling uneasy about the whole thing, wishing I'd never shared it. When I wake up and check the image board for responses, hoping someone can debunk that thing as some kind of animal, I notice among other responses, my own response. But it's a response I never left during a time when I'd been asleep. The response from what I thought must have been my hacked account has only a picture. That's a picture of me sleeping. I check my cell phone. There are several pictures on it of me sleeping. It helps me remember what my security guard friend had said about cell phones being stolen, and weird pictures being taken on them, as well as weird things being written on computers at that mall. It also brings to mind the noises I'd heard outside the night prior, those that I'd convinced myself were just animals. Making rounds throughout my house, I discover something disturbing. I hadn't even noticed when it had happened, but one of my windows in the living room, muffled behind thick curtains and blinds, has been shattered, like the shattered glass inside that mall. This story is called Active Shooter. It was a summer night like any other. The scent of freshly cut grass, catching adrift in the cool breeze under a dusk sky of deep blue light, just enough to see objects, but too dark to discern what they were. I was 4 houses down from my own, walking my dogs Sunny and Ruby while listening to the chirping and fluttering of crickets and locusts. So peaceful, but then the patio light of the house I was standing in front of flicked on. It was Mrs. Baker, an 80-year-old war widow whose husband died decades ago. She'd never since remarried. Her movements were, as best as I can describe them, different. This sluggish old woman operated abruptly with the speedy reflexes of a cat, head swiveling right to left repeatedly, and then at me. In a shrill voice, she said something that frayed my nerves. "Honey, get home. There's someone walking around with a gun shooting people." The streetlights kicked on at that moment, illuminating me like Olivier on a Broadway stage. Suddenly, a domino effect. The patio lights of all the other houses going on, one by one. "Active shooter. Get home." A random voice called out from a dark window. I became frozen beneath the lights, too petrified to move. An instant rush of déjà vu and blurry vision as I tried to reconcile this sudden overwhelming feeling of shock. "Go home, Kathy. There's an active shooter in the neighborhood." I pulled the dogs along with all my might until I reached the yard of Mr. and Mrs. Colby, where I shouted with shaking limbs and a cracking voice. "Sumner," he replied as his wife tried squeezing next to him in the doorway, pointing in the precise direction of my house. The rush of adrenaline I'd experienced in those few minutes, walking directly toward the woods dividing my street from Sumner Avenue, was the single most intense sensation I've ever felt. I'd never felt so alive. My pulse pounded as I approached the house, eyes fixed on the woods ahead of me, where I'd expected a masked figure to be hiding with an AK-47, ready to perniciously use me for target practice. Just before I'd gotten home, I'd noticed movement in the trees and bushes, but I didn't stick around to see who or what it was. My crippled sister, who lives in our basement, cried out for me the moment she heard the squealing front door hinge. "Bethel Park Police Department just called. There's an active shooter outside." I called my son to make sure he was safe, but he didn't answer. He lived in an apartment building 2 blocks on the other side of Sumner Avenue. He doesn't ever check his voicemail, so I texted him to please get home and stay safe. "It's okay, Mom. I'm safe. I love you." A sudden display of affection. My son has never said he loved me through a text interaction. Our relationship had been rocky for a few years, but finally things were simmering down. I watched out the living room window and saw countless human silhouettes in the windows of lit rooms, watching breathlessly as I was. The sense of danger I felt in those moments were more intimate and invasive than ever before at any point in my life. Clandestine peril. Now it was practically coming through my front door. The resounding wailing of police sirens only further served to violate my relatively unadorned existence of solace. My phone vibrated once more, and again, it was my son. "Do you need anything from the store?" "No, honey. I'm fine," I replied. "Okay. Just looking for something to do," he wrote. The wailing of the sirens faded away, and like a boomerang effect, had once again begun to get louder and closer, until the halting screech of tires reverberated through the walls. They were just outside of my house. "Stop. Where you are. Drop the weapon. Now. I texted him back with, "No, babe. Just get home safely." He sent me a heart emoji. I opened the side porch door, just a hair, hiding myself behind the blinds, only to see 6 or 7 cadets shielding themselves with their car doors, guns drawn, pointed to something out of my view, in the direction of those woods. Suddenly the tone of the commands changed to something much darker. "Don't do it. Think about your family. Put the gun down." I never heard a gunshot this up close before. It sounded like a firecracker, with almost no echo. Only one round was fired. Those poor cadets. The threshold dividing calm and trauma, broken so quickly, over something they'd surely had never believed or hoped they'd witness. As I peered through the crack of the porch door, the officers withdrew their firearms and went running out of sight. And this is where I wanted to open the door to walk out. Only an officer demanded, when he saw me in the doorway, that I stay inside, and that I wouldn't want to see it. This active shooter, as I found out, wasn't a threat to anyone but himself. And whomever he was, he ended his life just feet from my driveway. I called my son, and was relieved when he answered. The words just flowed out like a volcano, uninterrupted. "Brandon, I'm a little shook up right now. I know we haven't had the best of relationships lately, but I want us to put our differences behind us." "Kathy," I heard from the other end. "Brandon?" I asked. "No, it's Andy," the voice replied. "Andy is my son's roommate. Can you please put my son on the phone? He ran out for cigarettes," Andy said. "I guess he left his phone." "Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Andrew. Please have him call me back." "I will." For some reason, I felt, for just a moment, a natural electrical current run through me to my fingertips. What the hell is that? I asked myself. I noticed I'd received a text. When I opened it up, it was a screenshot from my son. Typed in cursive over a big red heart, it read as follows. "Mom, there's a space inside you. A space that's just you, that hasn't been spoiled, and it's really important that you keep that space sacred. I've been working on myself, and have never been happier. I love you, and hope to see you soon." I got a knock at my door, a few minutes later. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood across from me on my patio. And before any of us could say a word, they both removed their caps and looked to the ground. With a sunken heart and tears in my eyes, all I could stutter was, "I love you too, Brandon."
Please subscribe, or the toxic skull will come for you.